I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. On the next episode of The Trade Guys, we'll talk about USTR's info gathering operation, and we'll talk about Chinese leader Xi Jinping's visit to Europe. All on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we are back. We've got lots to talk about. I'm sure rants are coming, but first, we want to go to Bill, who has a plug for next week. Bill.
Special event, next week's podcast is going to feature our first member of Congress. We've not had any before, and it's going to be Representative Susan Delbaney, who represents the 1st District of Washington, home of Kirkland and Costco, according to Trade Guy Scott, home of the $1.50 hot dog and the $2,000 ounce of gold, for those of you that are in the discount gold business. Anyway, Representative Delbaney is on the Ways and Means Committee, has been very involved in trade issues over the years, and we're excited to have her on. Won't tell you yet what we're going to talk about, but it should be a fun event, and she's always interesting.
That will be super cool. Maybe she'll even have coupons for us for the hot dogs, and they go from like $1.50 to like 75 cents or something like that.
And maybe we can get her to talk to Costco about marketing Trade Guys merch.
There's a great angle.
There's an idea. Now you're talking.
You know, it's bobbleheads, and I think I said this before, we can sell two versions. The American version for $4.99 a pair and the Chinese version for 89 cents a pair. We'll see who believes in buying American.
I've always thought we need Trade Guys sunglasses, but, that could be secondary.
Well, according to Ambassador Tai, we don't make enough sunglasses in America, so anything we can do to increase demand.
That's because the best sunglasses are made in Italy, other than Ray-Ban, I guess.
The fashionable ones are made in Italy. Are those also the best ones?
I tend to think Ray-Bans, pound for pound are the best, but then I would instantly go to Pearsall, which is an Italian brand. Very, very good sunglasses.
Oakley is an American brand, but I don't think they're made here.
And beloved by Major League Baseball players and NFL players alike.
This shows a difference of category. I lose mine so frequently that I buy them at CVS for less than $20 a pair.
It's like a cheap pen for you, is what you're saying.
Yes, umbrellas are the same.
Okay.
So you always leave them someplace. So you just buy a bunch of cheap ones, and so it doesn't matter.
Got it. Well, look, next week we've got the member who represents the Costco district. So, hey, all of this is fair game, I guess.
Yeah, well, we'll take advantage of it.
All right. Well, in the meantime, let's talk about supply chain. USTR is gathering insights from industry on supply chain resilience. And the question I have to kick off for you guys is, what did USTR request for comments reveal about U.S. trade priorities?
Scott has a rant, so go ahead, Scott, and then I'll follow up.
Well, let me just say that I think that the USTR got pretty much what they deserved from this public hearing. They got a lot of well-rehearsed talking points from people who usually testify before bodies in Washington. And those talking points had a lot of opinions, but not much expertise on the real issues of what it takes to manage production networks. So I don't think they got much, and I think that's probably the way the project was established and carried out. That's about it. In fact, as I read through the statements by various groups, which, had strongly held opinions in them, but without much expertise of the real question of how do you make supply chains more resilient, I thought back to Animal House, as I often do, and the great character Otter, played by Tim Matheson.
The great Otter.
Yes. Who at one point said, I really think this situation absolutely requires a really futile and stupid gesture done on somebody's part. And
on our part.
On our part, in this case, that's about what was accomplished. And there's a reason for this. Look, there's great knowledge out in the American industry at various levels about how you operate supply chains effectively and how you make them more resilient. So it's not that the knowledge doesn't exist. But it's not going to come out in a public hearing in this kind of approach. And the reason is production networks, first, are insanely complicated. We talk about this all the time on the show at the industry, the firm, or the product level. And not only are they complex, but they're quite idiosyncratic. They'll differ a lot from company to company, even when producing the same product. More importantly, many companies, including my former employer, Procter & Gamble, considered its purchasing networks and its supply management to be a competitive advantage And therefore, a lot of what we did was covered by trade secrets. Employees, sign non-compete clauses and things to protect that knowledge. We've published our patents because that's what's required when you file a patent. But the knowledge that's embedded in operating production networks is very deep and very important to the success of the firm, and is not going to be shared in a public forum of any kind. Now, here's why this could have been avoided. 50 years ago, Congress foresaw this happening. And in the Trade Act of 1974, they created a whole series of what are called statutory advisory committees. That is, they're created by the Trade Act of 1974. And those lowest level advisory committees, I say lowest level, they had operating people from various industries and firms on them. They were closed meetings. They had people on the committees who had deep expertise in the specific industry itself. And those expert members had government surety clearances and were assured of confidentiality in the things they shared with government officials. This operated very well over the years in terms of USTR and the Commerce Department and the Department of Agriculture on the separate set of committees, getting the technical advice they needed to succeed. Now, what happened in the last 15 years is they've gone completely first out of fashion and then out of use. Back in 2010, the administration chose to basically replace all the experts with people who had helped them on the campaign. They had a different story than that. In fact, I think Bill was a plaintiff in a lawsuit about that dismissal of the experts.
Yeah, they fired me.
Yes, me too. When Bill had the guts to sue, D.C. Circuit ruled on this. Judge Brett Kavanaugh at the time wrote the opinion, and Bill's first, Fifth, and 14th Amendments were violated by the administration in that 2010 action. Not that it mattered, because they continued on staffing these committees with people that they wanted on versus people who had depth expertise. Then wind the clock ahead 2017, and Tariff Man didn't really need much advice about what his agenda was going. So I imagine these committees never got staffed back up because they weren't really that useful to the administration. So here we are 15 years later, and the administration is forced to hold public meetings instead of actually going to real experts that they had in a relationship where they could get candid, private advice and actually learn something and do something good from a policy standpoint. Bill, what did I miss?
Well, you didn't mention that I never made a dime off that lawsuit, but
none of us did. We all volunteered our time for these committees.
It was sad in a way. The lawsuit was done pro bono by a prominent Washington law firm, and we prevailed, but we prevailed essentially via remand and settlement. We lost in district court, and when it got to the appellate level, which is what you mentioned, basically what the appellate level said was the judge was wrong, and they sent it back to her to change the decision. And then we settled with the Justice Department, and they basically withdrew the position they had taken on. It was basically whether people who were lobbyists could serve on these things or not. And for a number of the plaintiffs, this was really life and death because their job was to represent their industry. They worked at a trade association and they were representing all the companies that made that stuff. And to get kicked off meant that those companies as a group were no longer being represented on committees that were doing things directly relevant to them. And the Obama administration alternative says, well, we'll pick somebody from one of the companies to do it. Well, that's fine for that company, but it's not fine for everybody else in the industry. So I think they got their jobs back. The irony was when the law firm that had done it pro bono, and it was not cheap, came back to the government seeking costs, because you are supposed to get costs when you win. The government declined to pay on the grounds that we didn't actually win, we just settled. And the fact that we got what we want via settlement doesn't count as winning. So the law firm in the end got nothing. But the plaintiffs got what they wanted. Anyway, I got a couple things out of this hearing that are, I think, worth talking about. The first, I think everybody knew already, but it was nice to have it repeated, and that is the supply chain issue and supply chain resilience depends on having information and sharing information. And witness after witness said, and a lot of this was in the context of how did you deal with COVID? There were a lot of questions about that, and other witnesses came in, not in that context, but others, and said, really, in order to make sure that our supply chains are functional, that we don't end up getting tripped up by COVID, earthquake, monsoon, whatever it is, we need information. We need to know who makes what and where they make it so that when the time comes, if we have to find another source, we've got a little universe of people to call on. That's not news. What was left out, and Scott implied in his comments, was whether or not companies who have that information are going to be willing to share it, and particularly whether they're going to be willing to share it publicly. Because if you're a buyer of electric wire harnesses or parts and components, you've got a supplier, okay? Maybe you've got two suppliers. But if you're worried about those suppliers going out of business, if there are Chinese suppliers getting shut down because there's another COVID wave, or because, Trump comes back and there's more China tariffs, for any reason, you're going to be looking for other suppliers. So how do you find them? Well, you need information. And the question is, are companies going to be willing to disclose publicly the kind of information that supply chain managers want, which is not only, hey, I make that, but, these are my terms and here are my specifications and this is what it's going to cost you. And that doesn't always have to be public, but I thought from the beginning, when the Commerce Department, as part of IPEF, had its supply chain pillar, that this was going to be the critical issue, because there they were trying to build not just U.S. domestic supply chains. They were trying to build supply chains that incorporated suppliers from IPEF countries. And it will inevitably come down to whether companies are willing to provide confidential business information to the United States government and or their own governments, which they may be reluctant to do for tax purposes, if nothing else. So that wasn't new, but the fact that a whole bunch of people said that that was important, I think is significant. And hopefully it will convince the government that they need to be thoughtful about how they develop their information infrastructure. The other thing that fascinated me, because it validated something that we at the Shoals Chair said in 2019, as I recall, was a discussion about rules of origin. And a number of people came in to talk about rules of origin. And I think you're going to hear more about rules of origin going forward, because when USTR talks about a trade policy for the workers, what they're really talking about is let's make sure the benefits of trade agreements flow to the workers and not to the corporate executives. And I've maintained over the years that that's hard to do, because the trade agreements create benefits. They don't necessarily distribute the benefits. You distribute the benefits through other government policies like adjustment assistance, education, tax policy, things like that. There's one exception to that, and that is you can redistribute benefits by rules of origin, maybe. And the classic example of that, which we studied, was automobile rules of origin in the USMCA agreement. Because you'll recall when NAFTA was renegotiated, turned into USMCA, one of the biggest issues was changing the auto rules, basically in ways that were designed to bring more jobs back to America. They increased the North American content percentages to discourage the inclusion of European or Japanese, Korean, or even Chinese content in Mexican auto assembly. And they also put in essentially a wage requirement that for some pieces of content had to be produced by workers making at the time, I think, more than $16 an hour, which meant Canadian or American workers, because Mexican workers were not there. And what our study concluded was that that would probably have the effect of moving parts and components employment into the United States. And our old friend Ed Gresser, whom we quote very often on the podcast, has done a study of what happened, because we did our study before this went into effect, so we could only speculate. And one of the things we speculated about was that if you construct your rules of origin and make them too complicated and have too much paperwork, people just aren't going to respond. And there's beginning to be some evidence to suggest that that was true. And Ed points it out, and he points it out in two categories that are interesting. He looked at CAFTA-DR, the Central American Agreement, that has very detailed and extensive textile and apparel rules that are designed, it's called the Yarn Forward Rule, that's designed to a shirt or dress, whatever, made in Central America, has to be made out of yarn or cloth that originated in the U.S. or one of the CAFTA countries. In other words, they can't use Chinese yarn or Chinese cloth to make a shirt in Central America and then call it a Central American shirt under our rules. But that rule, which itself is not that simple, was accompanied by a 22-page list of product-specific rules for particular garments and particular kinds of garments, of which in the end there were 31 different classes of garments. And Ed did a previous column where he talked about the stack of paperwork that you had to fill out simply to qualify, which amounted to several inches of paperwork. And he notes he testified at this hearing, and he notes that CAFTA-DR share of U.S. clothing imports has actually fallen, not much, but fallen from 10.1% in 2008 to 9.9% in 2023. That's not much of a decline, but it suggests two things, Ted. One, the rules probably were effective in preventing third country content from coming in, but they also turned out to be so strict and expensive to comply with that it has not produced an investment boom in Central America. you don't see a lot of American apparel companies, or other apparel companies for that matter, going to Central America and trying to use the rules to ship garments here. So it's not been as big a benefit for the Central American companies as they were hoping. The other interesting one is Ed looked at imports of Mexican-made cars into the United States. And last year, Mexican-made cars that came in not duty-free, in other words, they did not meet the rules of origin that I was just talking about, but they came in under the MFN tariff for cars, which is 2.4%. There were 468,000 Mexican-made vehicles that came in that way. That's 20% of the total that came in. But he compared that to 2018, which was before USMCA went into effect. In 2018, only 22,000 of the more than 2 million vehicles, or at that point, 1% of the Mexican cars came in duty-free. In other words, consistent with the NAFTA or USMCA requirements. What that suggests, and this is what we predicted, is that the rules are so complicated and the normal auto tariff is so small that it's actually cheaper to pay the smaller tariff and avoid the paperwork. So companies are not going to Mexico and trying to comply with all the rules of origin to get their cars in with zero duty. They're just going with the standard content rules and getting them in with 2.4%. So I think the bottom line here is that it's very instructive to me is that these things have not had the impact that they were intended to have going in. It's not been all negative. It has moved some jobs onshore, but it hasn't done that to the extent I think that either the union or the companies expected when these things were put into place.
You could certainly go too far. And I remember a lot of cross-border trade in chemicals between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, just because facilities were in different places and production was in different places. And our company faithfully reported the NAFTA preferences that we utilized for duty-free movement of chemicals cross-border in North America. And it was beneficial, but chemical tariffs are 5.5% or 6.5%, depending on the line. And at that level, the compliance was fairly straightforward. So the NAFTA preference did its job. It kept production in North America versus a relatively modest, but higher than 2.5% tariff on chemicals. 2.5% and simple known rules, which was the old NAFTA, kept the NAFTA rules useful. But when the rules got complicated, it was simpler for the company to build the cars they wanted to build in the way they wanted to build them and pay the 2.5% MFN tariff. So you can really push this so far that all the work you put into making restrictive rules goes out the window because people just ignore them, ship on an MFN basis, and act like there was never a trade agreement in the first place.
All right, guys, I think we beat this one to death. Good rants from both of you. I'm very impressed. But I also want to talk today about Chinese leader Xi Jinping's trip to Europe and how he has been received over there. First, he went to France, then to Hungary, then to Serbia. I think he's been to all three at this point. What's the takeaway from this?
Well, Europe is, I think, approaching this very pragmatically. They see the benefits of trade with China. They know it's a difficult relationship to manage, but China is both a large importer from Europe and a large exporter to Europe. And they're looking for sort of practical ways to advance the relationship that maintains their own interests and also, keeps an eye on the fact that there are tensions and issues, both economic and geopolitical, when it comes to trade with China. So I think they're taking the classic sort of practical mercantilistic role that Europe has almost always taken on its international economic interests. So that it strikes me as different in tone and manner than Secretary Yellen's trip to China and her conversations about excess capacity and the various issues raised. And not to mention the U.S. Congress's allergy toward all matters China, which seems somewhat over the top only because China is still the largest buyer of U.S. agricultural exports. And we haven't figured out a way to get some of the very basic materials that are produced in China and have a valid market and are useful in the United States. And without alternative sources of, say, rare earths and a number of materials that China's extraction industries offer otherwise unavailable or available in much smaller quantities and higher prices. We haven't really settled the conflicts within our own policy, but it seems to me Europe is showing a pragmatic approach here.
I thought it was noteworthy for lack of results. When he was in France, apparently the biggest thing that happened, Andrew, you'll appreciate this, was the Chinese apparently told him they were not going to retaliate by putting tariffs on French cognac, which is a big deal in France.
Yeah, sure.
But that's not exactly the bedrock of French industry. I think they were hoping for a giant Airbus deal because usually giant Airbus deals end up being made when there's a state visit, and there wasn't one. So we'll see in that category. What I'm looking for, and his last stop was Hungary, and I haven't seen any reports yet. If that was yesterday, I haven't seen what happened. Hungary's important from a couple respects. One, it's probably the only friend China's got inside the EU because the Italians have taken a turn away from them and dropped out of the Belt and Road Initiative. But Hungary is Huawei's largest base outside of China. And Hungary is going to be, and this is going to be interesting to see how it develops, the site of BYD's first European factory. BYD is the Chinese company that makes EVs, which are already coming into Europe in quantity. And if they build a factory there, you're going to see them in even more quantity. So it'll be interesting to see what the press reports say about that piece of the visit so far. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, has been not only more friendly to China, he's also been virtually the lone problem with respect to Ukraine.
Well, the Congress can't feel good about Viktor Orban embracing Xi Jinping, can it?
No, and I'm sure some of them there will find a way to go after him. Look for the Ohio senators. There's more Hungarians in Ohio than anywhere else, I think.
Well, probably Budapest has more, but yes, I mean, there are a lot of Hungarian Americans in Ohio.
There was a statistic a number of years ago, that said there were more Hungarians in Cleveland than there were in Budapest.
May have been true at one point. There certainly are a lot of Hungarians in Cleveland, that's for sure.
There are. And their cuisine permeates some of Cleveland.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Pierogies, goulash, all that stuff.
So why did the Hungarians go to Cleveland and the Poles go to Chicago and the Croatians go to Pittsburgh?
It was probably had to do with the timing of the migration waves and where the jobs were. I mean, at one time, Hamtramck, south of Detroit, had more Poles than any place but Warsaw. So they went to Michigan as well. But for whatever set of reasons, there was probably timing and industrialization that was going on at the time of the migration waves. Lots of Serbians in Cleveland as well. Let's see. Vojinovic, in any case, was Serbian ancestry and was both mayor of Cleveland and governor of Ohio and then United States senator. So a long tradition. Frank Laushi was a Slovenian American who was governor of Ohio, first mayor of Cleveland, governor of Ohio, and then the United States senator. Frank Laushi, long-serving public official, but he came from a very large Slovenian American community on the east side of Cleveland.
Well, nothing's going to help the Cleveland Browns unless Deshaun Watson is healthy this season. So
there's that.
Yes. Because you know why? Because they let the great Joe Flacco go after he took him to the playoffs.
He's not Serbian either.
No, but Joe Flacco in a Cleveland uniform was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And he seemed to have a lot of fun on the field while he was completing all those passes.
It was funny as long as he didn't have to play against the Ravens. Then it wouldn't have been funny.
Recalled the days of Don Strock and other people pulled off the golf course to quarterback the Cleveland Browns.
Absolutely. Well, guys, with that, we are out of time today, but we'll be back next week, as we said, with Congresswoman, and we'll be back at this same location wherever you get your podcast. Gentlemen, thank you for all the insight today and for a couple really first-rate rants. Anytime.
Exactly.
If you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.